Everyone, welcome to today's webinar on Tuesday, the 13th of December, 2022. This is a 90-minute webinar today that will cover sexual and reproductive rights and how you can become your own self-advocate. The webinar will cover the experiences, insights, and sharings from our various presenters that we have here today, which I'm very excited to introduce you to. We'll also be learning and hearing from international experts in human rights, learning about national and international issues, and how women, girls, feminine identifying, non-binary and gender diverse people with disability can advocate for their own sexual and reproductive rights. There will also be an opportunity for Q&A from our audience members. So first off, I'd like to introduce a little bit about myself and go through some housekeeping. My name is Aiki Ngo. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm honoured to be your host for today's webinar. Firstly, of course, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which I am virtually hosting to you from today. I'm a resident of Narn, the Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nations, also known as Melbourne, Victoria. It's the land of the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people, where sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And into a little bit of an introduction about me. Firstly, I would like to give a visual description of what I look like and my environment for any blind or low vision folks who may be joining us today. I am of Asian descent. I have long blue and pink hair. It's tied up in a half knot, and I have some black natural regrowth coming through. I am wearing prescription glasses. I have a nose piercing and I'm wearing a blue top. My background is blurred, but I'm currently in a hospital environment. As usual, a little bit of information about me, which you may already know of if you've joined us on previous webinars before. And if you have, thank you so much for tuning in again. About me, I'm an accessibility manager at Sydney World Pride, an advisor with NDIA, and I'm very passionate about all things disability and gender equity. I have over a decade of working in Australia and overseas, and I am a survivor advocate of intimate partner and family violence. I'm deeply connected to gender equity, including access to sexual and reproductive rights for all people, particularly women, girls, feminine identifying and non-binary people with disabilities. I'm a first-generation Aussie from a refugee background with a lifetime of personal lived experience as a chronically ill and disabled queer non-binary person. Wonderful Witter Lead Project Steering Committee and the Witter Lead Toolkit Co-Design Committee. But enough about me. I would now like to go through some housekeeping to ensure that you are able to access this incredibly exciting and important webinar today. So with housekeeping for everyone, to ensure that you are accessing this webinar in the best way that suits you, I'd like to just point out down the bottom of the screen, there are three main interactive features of this Zoom webinar that you are accessing. You will notice three buttons. One is the chat button, where you'll be able to type and send messages to, where you will be able to type and send messages. You will also be able to receive messages from the team or the group or other members of the audience, where you can chat and connect to one another or each other, and we will also be sending out links and other information in the chat function. To submit or ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button, where you can enter your questions and send them through. These will be formal questions, which will be collected as formal questions to be answered during the Q&A towards the end of the session. You can submit questions whenever you like. You can towards the end, during when a presenter is presenting, or any time during this webinar when a question comes to you, it will be submitted, moderated, and we will get to the questions during the Q&A. However, if your question does not get answered during the webinar, we'll also follow up with you afterwards. You can also click on the CC button, which is closed captions, and that will activate closed captions, which can be toggled on and off as you like. If at any stage today during this webinar you are experiencing any technical difficulties and cannot continue, this webinar is and will be recorded and will be available to you via our website, which we will share with you when it becomes available. And on the note of any technical difficulties or if you're experiencing any issues or require any help whatsoever, please feel free to pop your support needs in the Q&A section or email our comms person, Jacinta, at comms, COMMS, at wwda.org.au, but perhaps just typing in the chat function might be the easiest, or the Q&A function. We will also have a feedback survey, which we will send out towards the end of this webinar, and we would really, really appreciate if you could provide some feedback to us, but of course, I'll remind you about that later on. Furthermore, if you would like to tweet this event live, here are some hashtags that you can use. It can be hashtag WWDA or hashtag WWDALEAD. Okie dokes, that's introductions, housekeeping out of the way. So, of course, I would really love to welcome I would really love and be honoured to welcome our Auntie Yvonne Weldon from the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council and Gadigal Land to do our Welcome to Country today. Auntie Yvonne Weldon has over 30 years of experience working in key government and Aboriginal organisations, driving positive reform in health, education and child protection. Auntie Yvonne is an independent councillor of the City of Sydney and the first Aboriginal councillor in its 180-year history. She also serves as the Deputy Chair of the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council, Deputy Chair of the New South Wales Australia Day Council, and as a board member of the Domestic Violence New South Wales and Redfern German College. Welcome, Auntie Yvonne.
Thank you, and hello everyone. As was said, my name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman from Karin here in New South Wales, from the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee Rivers. I am the Deputy Chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land I'm on. I acknowledge the people on the land of the Eora Nation, and I bring a respect and recognition of the Eora Nation's culture and identity, promoting a vision of working together as one community and achieving as one community. I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to you and the many nations represented that you are on today virtually. The boundaries of our traditional owners are not defined by the hand or by the pen, but through the natural landscapes of the earth. The Eora Nation's country covers the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. The First Nations of this continent, the Aboriginal people, are the most resilient, unique, and sustainable people on the planet. We have been a part of this land for more than 65,000 years, and we are the oldest living culture of the world. Being here today has me reflecting about what has been achieved in the last few years, what has changed. Have there been changes that improve the lives of all, especially all of us that are online today? You can help make positive change in everything that we do, not just through work, but through our everyday life. What you see and what you accept, or rather, what we can no longer accept. And to give recognition, could you all please pause for a moment to remember the many sacrifices that we have made along the way, the ones we will continue to make, and those that should never happen. As you connect, learn, and share today, tomorrow, and beyond, continue to commit to make positive change, not just condoning plans, but in real action with real outcomes on the ground, in our homes, in the attitudes, in every part of our life, particularly our society, of what cannot no longer be accepted. What has taken place in the past should not be accepted. It shouldn't have been accepted then, not now, and certainly not into our future. Together, we must bring about a positive future for all of us, especially those that grow up and repeat cycles that should never existed in the first place. Continue to help others through your representation or just being a helpful friend, being the voice for the rights of others that are often told that they don't have any. And make sure the decision-making that we all do doesn't bring about further heartache or suffering. So don't live regretting what we should have done, but create the legacy of what must be done. All of us together can bring about positive changes to multiple generations. We are in this together and we can make a difference. So let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Wow, thank you so much, Auntie Yvonne Walden. Such important words, and there is so much that you've shared that is really able to be reflected on. Don't live with regret for what could have been done and what we can do. We can all make a difference, and not repeating what's happened in the past. So thank you for that incredible welcome to country. Your welcomes are always so heartfelt and so truly appreciated. Thank you so much for that. And I'm sure we will all reflect on the past and strive for a better future for everyone. Next, I would just like to move on to funding acknowledgements, a little bit about Women with Disabilities Australia, where to lead, and just an introduction of our speakers and presenters, and we'll hop right into the webinar. So just a little bit about WIDA, or Women with Disabilities Australia, WWDA. For those that do not know about Women with Disabilities Australia, we are the national Disabled People's Organisation, or DPO, that represents more than 2 million women, girls, feminine identifying and non-binary people with disabilities across Australia. For almost over 20 years, our goal at WIDA is to be a national voice, a national force, and a national presence for all women, girls, feminine identifying and non-binary people with disabilities to improve the lives and opportunities for all of our community. We use the term women and girls with disability on the understanding that it is completely inclusive of women, girls, feminine identifying, gender diverse, and non-binary people with disability within Australia. The WIDA and WIDA Lead project is an award-winning the WIDA Lead project is a project that was started in 2019. It is a groundbreaking, exciting information linkages and capacity building project, which has been using co-design and meaningful intersectional representation to develop sustainable, achievable, and accessible outcomes in leadership, networking, engagement, empowerment, and opportunities to build both individual and community capacity for all women and girls with disability. LEAD stands for Lead, Engage, Activate, and Drive. It is to promote and advance leadership, agency, autonomy, human rights, and the freedoms of women and girls with disability across Australia, both individually and collectively. WIDA is an award-winning national DPO, a National Women's Alliance, or NWA, for all women, girls, feminine identifying and non-binary people across Australia. WIDA deliver a huge range of activities and initiatives to build our capacity and the leadership skills of our community, including a wide range of peer networking, leadership, mentoring, scholarships, online programs, and various activities. We would like to sincerely thank the Department of Social Services for the funding for the WIDA Lead project through the ILC, or Information Linkages and Capacity Building Program. You will all be provided with a link to access today's webinar. As I mentioned, it is being recorded, as well as previous webinars that we have undertaken up until this moment, which are all have lots of different important topics. And when that becomes available to you, it will be on the WIDA website, on our socials, and also via email. We would also like to acknowledge the WIDA Lead Project Steering Committee and all the WIDA Lead staff and team who have come to create today's fantastic webinar. Okay, so now for the main part of today's webinar, I would love to introduce you to our incredible lineup of amazing guest presenters. We have four. We have Rosemary Kayess, we have Kelly Cox, Karin Smith, and Iz Hay. So it is my great honour to introduce Rosemary. Rosemary Kayess is an internationally recognized and well-respected human rights lawyer in the area of disability. She's the current chairperson of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Rosemary teaches international human rights law at the Faculty of Law, the University of New South Wales. Rosemary was a designated expert on the Australian government delegation to the United Nations negotiations for the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disability, drafting Article 24 on the right to education. Welcome, Rosemary, and we cannot wait to have your presentation today and learn of your insights.
Thank you very much, Aki. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you're based in Australia today or around the world. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we are all participating in this webinar. I'm on Bejigal land of the Eora Nation. This land has never been ceded. It is Aboriginal land. It always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people that have joined us today. I'd also like to thank Women with Disabilities Australia for inviting me to speak on this important topic. This is a good time of year to have a focused discussion on the rights of people with disability. We have just had the International Day of People with Disability, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, and Human Rights Day. People with disability continue to experience violations of sexual and reproductive rights. This is despite the International Human Rights Framework, which protects and promotes sexual and reproductive rights for everyone, including people with disability. The International Bill of Human Rights, which incorporates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was developed in 1948, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted in 1966, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, also adopted in 1966, sets out the human rights framework that applies to all people as part of the human family. These three instruments set out the principles of equality and dignity and the rights of non-discrimination, autonomy, bodily integrity, health, privacy and freedom from torture, violence and abuse. So these principles have been part of law for a long time, and these principles all underpin sexual and reproductive rights. However, these principles haven't always been applied to particular groups of people, including people with disability. The violations of women's rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, led to the adoption of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, in 1979. CEDAW emphasises that the rights of women and girls include the right to autonomy, privacy, confidentiality, informed consent and choice, and non-interference by governments. This is the guarantee for sexual and reproductive health and rights. The violations of children's rights led to the adoption of the Convention of the Rights of the Child in 1989. The violations of children's rights, the Convention affirms that everyone, including children, have the right to autonomy and self-determination over their own bodies. This is the principle of bodily integrity, which upholds everyone's right to be free from acts against their body, which they do not consent to. The violations of the Rights of People with Disability led to the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006. There are a number of interrelated articles in the CRPD that affirm that people with disability enjoy sexual and reproductive rights on an equal basis with others. Importantly, CRPD explicitly recognises that people with disability are not a homogenous group. Disability is one of several layers of identity, and the multiple dimensional layers of identity, statuses, and life realities interact with each other at the same time and in such a way as to be inseparable. This embeds intersectionality within the CRPD and places obligations on governments to recognise and address intersectional discrimination, including for women and girls with disabilities, children with disabilities, LGBTIQA+ people with disability, Indigenous people with disability, and people with disability from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. The intersection between disability and other multifaceted layers of identity and difference result in different experiences of discrimination and inequality. Ableism is the core of the power relations that privilege people without disability and devalue people with disability. The power relations inherent to ableism and those inherent to, for example, racism, sexism, cysto-heterosexism, all share a common space of the devalued other, in contrast to the privileged norm of humanness. The CRPD challenges ableism, and by challenging ableism, it benefits all of us who fall into the category of devalued other. So the CRPD reaffirms the principles of equality and dignity and the rights of non-discrimination, autonomy, bodily integrity, health and privacy, and freedom from torture, violence and abuse, and applies these principles to the unique and specific violations of sexual and reproductive rights that are experienced by people with disability, such as forced sterilisation, forced contraception, forced menstrual suppression, forced abortion, growth attenuation treatment, intersex genital mutilation, conversion therapies, denial of sexual and gender expression, the removal of children, and the denial of parenthood and sexual relationships. Ableist attitudes underpin our devalued cultural and social perceptions of people with disability and are embedded in the structures and institutions of our society. The social transformation needed to guarantee sexual and reproductive rights will require not only attitudinal change, but structural and systemic reform. For example, many people with disability don't have the power to make their own decisions, and others make decisions on their behalf. This could be through formal guardianship arrangements or through informal decision-making by parents, carers, support workers, group home staff, and others. In terms of sexual and reproductive rights, third-party consent and decision-making violates the universal standard of bodily integrity and autonomy. Changing this situation will require a fundamental shift in law and policy to recognise the right of people with disability to make their own decisions, in establishing supported decision-making mechanisms, in challenging vested interests involved in guardianship, and ensuring that the universal standard of bodily integrity and autonomy are accorded to people with disability on an equal basis with others. People with disabilities share sexual and reproductive rights on an equal basis with others. Women with Disabilities Australia is at the forefront and instrumental in exposing violations of sexual and reproductive rights, advocating for systemic and attitudinal change, and achieving policy and law reform. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge all the advocates and those that are becoming strong self-advocates through this program that have joined us today. My role on the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities relies on your expertise and commitment to realising sexual and reproductive rights for all people with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Rosemary. It was exceptionally insightful and difficult to recognise and understand that we do have so many frameworks, bills and principles and international laws and frameworks that exist, yet we are still having abuses towards our human rights today, particularly our sexual and reproductive rights, and that the recognition and the determination on our bodily autonomy, and knowing that we still very much do need to enforce the CRPD, and recognising the intersectionalities that you've mentioned and how those power and balance and oppressive structures impact and devalue us, and the ableism that is experienced. But it's really great to know all the work that you do, that you continually do, to reinforce the CRPD, reaffirming our principles for dignity and equality and freedom from all of the various tortures, violences, experiences and abuses that you listed, which are all very horrible and we recognise do currently happen, and highlighting that we are working towards and continue to work towards improved structures and systemic reforms for our bodily autonomy, and ensuring supported decision makings and the changes, the need of great change, systemic and attitudinal change. Thank you for thanking all the advocates for both our systemic and self-advocates, but we would also hugely like to thank you for all your endless, tiring work that you've been doing for such a long time, and continue to do, and we feel your passion. We work beside you, with you, and obviously Women with Disabilities Australia value all the work that you contribute and will continue to contribute and hope to contribute alongside you. Thank you so much, Rosemary. Next, I would love to introduce you to Kelly Cox, who works with other disabled people to effect change around disability and human rights issues. This has included better provisions of services within the NDIS, lobbying for a Royal Commission, and a wide range of other local, national and international issues. As a disabled woman, Kelly has first-hand understanding and lived experiences of issues affecting disabled people. She has been actively involved in representing the rights of disabled people both nationally and internationally, and is a contributing member of the disability rights movement in Australia. She is passionate about working to uphold the rights of all disabled people to ensure that they are able to live a life that they want, with specific interests in natural disaster recovery, violence prevention, and intersectional issues, and the ways these further marginalise and disadvantage people with disability. She believes that we should make all disabled people have a voice, especially people who come from exceptionally marginalised backgrounds. Welcome, Kelly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm joining you from the Bundjalung Nation in northern New South Wales. I've got a couple of dogs roaming around the house, so I apologise in advance if there are any barking or other mischief. And I'm sitting in my kitchen to get the most reliable internet connection. Hopefully no one wanders in behind me, but no promises on that one. For those of you that I haven't met either in person or online, my name is Kelly Cox. I live in Ballina in New South Wales, and I've been actively involved in the disability rights movement in a variety of ways over the past decade or so. Although my interest and passion for social justice goes back much further than that. I do my best to represent my community when opportunities arise. Some of my most recent roles, I was the Vice President of People with Disability Australia. I do various bits and pieces for WIDA and for First Peoples Disability Network. And I was also fortunate to be the co-lead at the UN for the Conference of State Parties for CRPD earlier this year. Such an honour and learning opportunity. Despite all of that, I'm still not as confident when speaking publicly as I'd like to be. Anxiety gets the better of me and brain fog rolls in. For that reason, I read from pre-written notes. I'll do my best not to tap buttons too hard as I scroll, but if you hear it, you'll know what the noise is. I actually never expected to be doing any of the things I do now. I'm someone who grew up in a small town where there were limited opportunities for any young person, much less one with a disability. I didn't finish high school. I got halfway through year 9 and then left to go into a heap of internalised ableism fueled trouble. I've left the bad behaviour behind, but like for most of us, the internalised ableism is still an ongoing battle. Pride and community go a long way toward helping with that. And I hope that the work we're all doing makes it so much easier for future generations to see their worth and demand their rights. A bit of a visual description for anyone who needs it. I'm a woman with straight but slightly frizzy hair. It sits about just above my shoulders. I've got brown roots with copper ends. I'm wearing clear framed glasses with a short golden chain around my neck. I'm sitting in my wheelchair with a black dress on, and in the background are white kitchen cupboards and a white fridge. Yeah, so when I was at the UN earlier this year, I spoke about the impact of natural disasters on disabled people. I live in an area that experienced major flooding in February and again in March this year. Most of you probably heard about the Lismore floods. That's not far from where I live, and many people I know, both in Lismore and in the towns down the river, had some terrible experiences. Recovery is still ongoing with no end in sight for many. I took a collection of stories about the way the floods impacted disabled people to the UN. So there was an opportunity to hear first-hand accounts. A copy of that booklet can be found on the WIDA website if anyone wants to read it. What I'm going to touch on today, though, is some of the ways sexual and reproductive rights can be impacted in the face of pandemics, natural disasters, and other catastrophic events. It's an area that often isn't thought about enough, and that's been really clear over the last week as I spoke to people about this webinar. Most people hadn't thought about it and couldn't think what the issues might be once it was brought to their attention. So during the COVID lockdowns, we saw news articles that raised the issues for many people accessing IVF. Issues ranging from interrupted cycles, financial strains, and risks associated with not being able to continue at another point in the future. These are all issues that affect disabled people, sometimes disproportionately, especially when it comes to financial strains due to continuing rates of poverty and disadvantage related to employment and all other areas of life. And these aren't just issues that arose during COVID lockdowns. They come up every time there is a fire or a flood or any other type of emergency situation that is ongoing. The stress and pressure this puts on people is enormous. Accessing any kind of medication, scroll too far, sorry. Accessing any kind of medication in these situations can be difficult. It's common to be cut off from the chemist, so being able to get your regular medication if you're low becomes impossible. And this includes birth control. For disabled women who are relying on support to access a chemist or birth control in general, this often creates further issues as someone else may decide it's not that important and refuse to assist in ensuring there is enough to last the expected period of disruption, or to help figure out how to request and access them in a way that they might for other medications. We constantly see these erosions of rights, the ones that many people might classify as minor, but there are some big consequences that can go with them, and it's not at all for other people to decide what is and isn't important for someone else. I get really annoyed when people have to fight for basic things like this, and it happens way more than it ever should. One of the other things that was horrifically common during the COVID lockdowns was the way people in group homes and other institutions were treated. And just to be clear, I supported the lockdowns and other safety measures. I called for them, I called for vaccine and mask mandates, and I'm disappointed and cranky that there are no safeguards in place at all now. That said, there is no excuse for the harm caused to some people during this time. Some providers made rules that extended beyond what the government put in place, and at times the penalty for breaking them was harsh, including eviction during a pandemic. Having a partner when you live in an institution isn't easy at the best of times, but to be totally prevented from seeing your partner, even when health and the government said it was okay, was unacceptable. The threat of eviction for doing so, even more so. I doubt any of the staff enforcing such rules would follow them themselves. And I also wanted to touch on how unsafe evacuation centres can be for the queer community. These centres are set up at very short notice and often rely on volunteers. Many of them do great work, but there are ongoing issues related to discrimination, homophobia and transphobia, both from some volunteers and from some members of the public who are also accessing the centre. And as a final point, and one that is too complex to go into detail about today, there is growing evidence on the impact climate change has on pregnant women and babies. Increased temperatures, poor air quality from fires, and contaminated water from floods has a negative impact on health. And this can lead to increased health problems across people's life. Preterm birth and both maternal and infant mortality. This is something that cannot continue to be ignored by governments around the world. It is time to act and take what is happening seriously. And that's about time for me. These are such complex topics that really need to be explored in much more depth. And I hope that from today it gives some people a starting point for thinking about it more, and it generates conversation and learning opportunities for everybody. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Kelly. That was a lot of really, really important points and connections that you made. Firstly, thank you for sharing your insights, experiences, and all your really important interests and passions. Congratulations on your work as the co-lead for the CRPD this year. That would have been a really incredible experience. Your sharing of the experiences of the Lismore floods and how climate change impacts people with disabilities and how it directly connects to our access to healthcare, including sexual and reproductive rights, is probably a link that many people didn't or haven't been able to make. And as you said, it is happening way more often than it should. And it is disappointing how little sexual and reproductive health is valued in those situations. And it's not viewed as a crucial service, which it absolutely is. And it's so important to recognise that in ongoing emergency situations, that anything related to our healthcare, especially our reproductive health and rights, is considered, particularly when natural disasters are happening, and when you mentioned safety for queer communities and other marginalised communities, when things are brought up on short notice and there aren't lots of those considerations, it is definitely a huge topic that is not possible to be covered in a small time frame, but you have really been able to highlight so many different ways that they are connected and how we are impacted, and recognising that people with disabilities, women with disabilities are and can be disproportionately impacted by by climate change, by natural disasters, and by all of what we've experienced in the past 2 to 3 years with a pandemic, and how much it is so important to really think about these connections, these links, and a really great time to start to act or act further, take it more seriously, So thank you again, Kelly, for sharing that. It was deeply insightful and very keen to know what and how we can all contribute to creating greater change for all of these aspects. Thank you. Next, I would love to introduce Karin. Karin Swift has an extensive career in the disability advocacy and social policy space, where she is committed to people with disability living valued lives in the community. Karin is a past president of Women with Disabilities Australia and has extensive background in governance roles for other non-government organisations. Karin has represented the Australian government and WIDA at the Commission on the Status of Women 57, CSW 57, held at the United Nations, New York, providing high-level strategic advice on women and with disabilities and violence, presenting at various side events as well. Karin has also led training alongside the Australian Human Rights Commission, AHRC, and has been a keynote for women with disabilities in Australia. A keynote speaker for WIDA in Indonesia and South Korea on gender and disability and the elimination of violence. Karin has previously worked at Queenslanders with Disability Network, QDN, in various roles and has provided strategic high-level advice and analysis on many contemporary disability issues and other social policies, including human rights, gender issues, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, aka the NDIS, and the Disability Royal Commission, Housing, Transport, Welfare Reform and Employment. Welcome, Karin.
Thank you, Aki, for that introduction. And I'm just going to bring up my notes. So to begin with, I'd like to give a visual description of myself. I have reddish brown, wavy, shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing a dark blue dress with white spots. I'm also wearing brown glasses. I'm sitting in my wheelchair in a room with light green walls and a whiteboard in the background, and the door of the room is behind me. I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera nations of Brisbane, where I'm coming from to you from today, their elders, past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge that this land was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to acknowledge all the traditional lands we're meeting on today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present in this webinar. I would also like to acknowledge that the term women and girls with disability is also inclusive of gender diverse, non-binary people and feminine identifying women and girls. I also acknowledge that the work of Women with Disabilities Australia is used throughout my presentation. So, as Rosemary has already clearly articulated, according to the United Nations, rights to reproductive and sexual health include the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person, the right to health care and information, and the right to non-discrimination and the allocation of resources to health services and in their availability and accessibility. Of central importance are the rights to autonomy and privacy in making sexual and reproductive decisions, as well as the rights to informed consent and confidentiality in relation to health services. Women and girls with disabilities have the right to access adequate sexual and reproductive health care and to make decisions about their own body and relationships. I'm proud to be a member of Women with Disabilities Australia, an organisation that supports the rights of all women and girls with disabilities to control and make free and informed decisions about their body, sexuality, health and relationships. As Aki mentioned, one of my proudest moments as an advocate was to represent the NGO Australian Government delegation at CSW 57 at the UN in New York. Working with the Australian government, we were successful in getting sterilisation and other forced medical practices recognised as torture in the conference's agreed conclusion. So according to WIDA's position statement number 4, sexual and reproductive rights, recognising sexual and reproductive rights encompasses the basic right of all couples and individuals to found and maintain a family, including the right to decide freely and responsibly the number, spacing, and timing of their children, and to have access to the information and means to do so. Women and girls with disability are largely excluded and ignored in the sexual and reproductive rights and health policy, service and program development, including the development of information, education and training resources. Women and girls with disability have the same right to sexual pleasure, expression, association, equity, privacy, freedom, autonomy and self-determination. Locally, nationally and globally, women with disability are demanding and reclaiming their sexual and reproductive rights and freedoms, such as this webinar we're all on today. The fundamental purpose of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability, or CRPD, is to promote, protect, and to ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and freedoms by all persons with disability, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. So in Queensland, I've been involved in work around developing a Queensland women's health strategy. In this work, I've spoken to many women with disability who report experiencing great barriers to accessing any and all healthcare, including insecure finances. Many women and girls with disability live in poverty and face unemployment, underemployment, and job insecurity. Women with disability are often faced with tough choices in relation to their health and often balance the need to save money for food and other necessities versus the need to look after our health. This has been particularly prevalent during the pandemic, as Kelly touched on, when job insecurity has been paramount and women who were already vulnerable health-wise were making tough choices about seeking medical attention or just staying at home. Women with disabilities experience violence at a disproportionate rate across a greater number of settings, including in the home, in services, institutions, medical settings, hospitals, schools, churches. The types of violence are wider and can include forced medical procedures such as hysterectomy, menstrual suppression, forced birth control, etc. There's a lack of accessible transportation and inaccessible location of medical facilities. Many women and girls have limited to no accessible and affordable transport options. Many are reliant on expensive maxi taxis to get around, even though this option is subsidised by most state and territory governments. It's still much more expensive than public transport options or share ride options. This therefore forces women to make tough choices about whether they're going to go to their doctor's appointment or spend time with their families. The location of some medical facilities can be inaccessible or out of reach for women and girls with disability. They're often not close to accessible transport hubs, or there are accessible issues once you get there. For example, the front entrance at the PA hospital in Brisbane is at the top of a big hill. Access to cancer screening programs. Many women with physical disabilities have difficulty accessing mammogram machines or getting on an examination table to have a pap smear. Some won't bother because they don't know how they will be able to get the assistance they need to undergo the test safely and with dignity. There is a perception that these programs don't cater for well for women with physical disabilities. To share a personal experience, I recently turned 50 and last week went to a breast screen clinic to have my first mammogram, as I have no previous medical history of breast cancer in my family. I was fortunate to have a kind, understanding radiographer who went to great lengths to attempt to complete the test. My support person and I were also very determined. Through sheer determination, I was able to position my wheelchair in a way that we were able to successfully scan my left breast. But due to the inaccessible equipment, it was impossible to test my right breast. I will now be referred to undergo a breast ultrasound, a procedure I've already been told by my GP and radiographer is less successful in detecting breast cancer. Another issue that I've found in my research up in Queensland is caregivers are not being able or have the time to seek help for their medical concerns due to their roles and responsibilities. So women experience a number of behaviours from medical professionals, which lead to women with disabilities feeling powerless to get their medical needs met. These behaviours include things like gatekeeping from doctors who only see the person's disability and think that every medical issue is related to their disability and therefore other issues are ignored or looked over. Not feeling validated by health care professionals. Healthcare professionals may be particularly dismissive of pain, and medical gaslighting, causing women with disability to doubt themselves and potentially not listen to their bodies. Practitioners addressing patients' concern to a carer or support worker and not to them directly has also been noted. Many women are concerned about the rising costs of medications and the increasing numbers of medications no longer available on the PBS. Many women I've spoken to in Queensland feel depleted and exhausted at constantly trying to have to advocate for one's health and generally report experiencing poorer health outcomes. So what needs to happen? I've started to make a list of recommendations, and I want to acknowledge that some of these are paraphrased from the work of WIDA. So women and girls with disability need to be a priority cohort in any health strategy. Nothing about us without us. Genuine co-design led by women and girls with disability to ensure health services are accessible and inclusive of all women, including ableism as a social determinant of health in an attempt to address and stamp out the discriminatory and stereotypical beliefs and practices that occur every day to women and girls with disability in healthcare settings. Prohibiting the practice of sterilisation of women and girls and people with disability without their free and informed consent, and immediately withdraw Australia's interpretive declaration on the Conventions on Rights for Disability, including Article 12, equal recognition before the law, Article 17, protecting the integrity of the person, and Article 18, liberty in movement and nationality. Develop accessible and appropriate resources on sexual and reproductive health for women and girls with disability, their families, support workers, health professionals, and frontline staff. And here's the key part of the advocacy. These resources must be co-designed by women and girls with disability and their representative organisations. We really must speak out about that. So developing a national strategy to ensure women and girls with disability can access sexual and reproductive health services on an equal basis as all others. Develop comprehensive, equitable, accessible and disability inclusive sexual and reproductive health education that is peer-led by people with disability and inclusive of all disability. And lastly, ensure people with disability can use their NDIS supports to gain access to sexual and reproductive health services and information, including their funded supports to realise their rights to sexual health information, sexual pleasure, expression, association, freedom, autonomy, and self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. That was exceptionally insightful. Firstly, I share your exhaustions and frustrations, and I'm sure many of us here today do. We really do need to be prioritized, and there are so many factors to consider when it comes to our healthcare, our reproductive rights. Sharing your experience of not being able to get a mammogram, that's seen as something relatively basic, but is actually not necessary when we think about and consider accessibility or inaccessibility or lack of accessibility. And so the fact that you have to now go through numerous other loopholes just to get something people consider as something quite straightforward. So accessing seemingly considered basic services actually isn't that simple and isn't that straightforward. And there are so many barriers, ongoing disadvantages that do impact all of our lives and our ability to be able to access the services that are absolutely necessary to us, including something, once again, seemingly as simple as taxis and public transport and accessibility of services, whether to get to a service or receive the service. Thank you for the work that you've done with the UN in recognising that sterilisation is indeed torture. Forced sterilisation is indeed torture and clearly does need to be prohibited. And recognising that everyone should have the right to access healthcare for our bodies and make decisions about our own body, our sexuality, our health and relationships. There are so much to consider. There's so many factors that impact each and every one of us every single day. And all of us, as you've highlighted, have the right and should have the right to access these supports. You've given us numerous incredible suggestions for the ability to create much needed change. Many systemic but also practical ways to create this change, co-design being a very big factor of that, with genuine and lived experience representation so that we as a community have equal basis as everyone else to be included, valued and supported in our reproductive health, peer-led, and obviously being able to use our, if applicable, NDIS supports to access things such as reproductive health supports as appropriate. So thank you so much, Karin, for sharing both your professional as well as personal experiences in relation to this incredibly important topic. Next, I would like to introduce you to our, I would like to now introduce you to our next presenter. Is, hey, they, them, is a disabled, queer, trans, mad, autistic young person living, working and resting on stolen Wurundjeri Wurrung land. They are passionate about taking down institutions of oppression and ableism and forcing systems to change rather than waiting and hoping that they will. They have 2 cats, a blue-tongued lizard, and give or take 100 plants, all of whom are revolutionaries. Welcome, Is. Cannot wait for you to share.
Is speaking. Thank you so much. And it's been an honour to hear everyone sharing before me. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in from the stolen land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to pay my respects to elders now and throughout history, and affirm that this land was violently taken, that sovereignty has never been ceded, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As a visual description for myself, I'm a white trans person with short, almost curly brown hair, bright pink glasses, a bunch of facial piercings, and a yellow t-shirt. My background is a wooden wall with a big plant and lots of art. I was originally going to speak on 5 things that define sexual and reproductive rights. But after hearing the 3 speakers before me, I've actually decided to completely change what I'm going to speak about, because they've covered a lot of those points. Instead of telling you the facts that women, gender diverse, and other people with disability who have marginalized genders connect to the issues around accessing sexual and reproductive rights, I'm not going to tell you those facts. I'm instead going to tell you some stories. So with Amnesty International's guidance, I put together, which just means I've Googled Amnesty International, I've put together what I believe 5 parts of sexual and reproductive rights are. And for each of them, I'm going to tell you a story about how I, as a disabled, young, queer and trans person, navigate accessing these rights. Part 1, making decisions about your body and what happens to it. I have many stories that I wanted to bring up relating to this, but I think a really big one is my transness and the community of trans people around me. We have to go through so many hoops to fight to even have a body that is ours. So not only making sure things don't happen to our bodies that we don't consent to and that we don't want, but also fighting for the things that we need to happen to our bodies and making the decisions about them. Currently, there are so many laws across Australia and the world that make it difficult or even impossible for trans people to access our own bodies in the ways that we want them. This is an essential part of being able to participate in things like sex and reproductive health. So to not even be able to have a body that feels like ours because the world deems that as too ridiculous or makes it so expensive is fundamentally oppressive and means we can't even access parts of these conversations. Part 2 is accessing sexual and reproductive health services, including contraception. Often, and I'm sure every disabled person in the room will know this, we have to compromise one or many parts of ourselves in order to access any form of services, but particularly sexual and reproductive health services. Perhaps one time I talk about being autistic because I know that that is most relevant to the sensory input of an STI test for myself. But I can't mention the fact that I'm queer because I know that I will be seen as too complicated for the doctor that I'm seeing. Perhaps I mention the way in which my own relationship to my body and the parts of my body related to sex and reproductive rights cause me dysphoria, but I don't then mention that I also have endometriosis, a debilitating pain condition directly on these organs. Thinking about how that we can't actually access sexual and reproductive health services in full because all of the parts of ourselves as queer disabled people are seen as far too much for any medical practitioner to understand or want to understand. Part 3, Amnesty International defined this as choosing if, when, and who to marry, but I'm changing it to if, when, and who we love, have sex with, and marry if we want. I mean, firstly, disabled people are often seen as kind of inherently non-sexual or incapable of being able to consent to or frankly desire sex. And this is something that I didn't realize, but I'd internalized for much of my life. When meeting my current partner, I had to have a conversation being that I had no idea how I could even have sex, that it was even an option for me. And I was grateful that my partner is also trans and disabled, so we got to go on this journey together. But knowing that nowhere was there ever communication to me from systems about how I could even do these things, if I could do these things. Then when you add additional layers around marriage, in many countries around the world, disabled people lose our government support after getting married, because it's determined that if we are capable of getting married, well, we mustn't be disabled enough to need support. And adding layers around same-sex marriage, which only passed in Australia in 2017, that's just over 5 years ago. And homosexuality was only decriminalised in the 1990s across Australia. This doesn't make it easy for disabled queer people to even know that we can access things like sex, love, and marriage, let alone the ways in which our rights are denied in each of these spaces more broadly. Part 4, making decisions about children, including if we have them, how many we have, when we have them, how we have them, who we have them with, and what happens if we can't or don't want to. I think for this, I want to talk about my future, hopefully. I have always wanted to be a parent ever since I knew the concept existed. One of my first special interests as an autistic child was actually pregnancy. As a 5-year-old, while other children were playing with Lego, I was reading Wikipedia article upon scholarly article upon book about pregnancy and the creation of life in that way. But I'm going to have a really hard time of experiencing that myself. My partner and I are both trans people. We won't be able to have a baby so-called naturally. I also have a lot of disabilities that I've had doctors tell me means that I'm probably infertile and that I should just consider adoption. I definitely have considered adoption, but and this is kind of related to this topic, but usually disabled people aren't considered fit enough to be parents when we come to topics like this. And so when I'm ready to have my family with my partner, it is going to cost me tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to be able to do that in a way that enables my disabled and trans body to carry children in a way that is determined accessible for most other people. Additionally, I think when we've talked about forced sterilization by other people today, I want to also acknowledge that in a lot of countries around the world, things like abortions are only allowed for people for whom the fetus is considered disabled. The discourse around disabled people not wanting to be brought in the world, whilst also believing that abortion is not valid, is a very complicated thing for myself as a disabled person. My own relationship to the topic of abortion took a very long time for me to be comfortable with, and I don't even think I am comfortable with it, because I fundamentally, I'm not even pro-choice, I'm pro-abortion. But to think that somebody might want to have an abortion just because they wouldn't want someone like me in the world is pretty complicated. So bringing all of that into that conversation, I think, is very important. And finally, the final factor of access to sexual and reproductive rights is getting accurate information about the 4 parts that I've already talked about. Any information for any of the topics that I've talked about today is always made for what I call a usual suspect. This is a white person, a cis person, a heterosexual person, a non-disabled person, someone in the middle or upper class, somebody who isn't an addict, somebody who hasn't experienced homelessness, among other things. The only information that I can get for someone like me, even though I do have a lot of privileges of being a white person and living in Australia and having access to education, the only accurate information I get is from other people in my community. We are forced to be educators and information providers for other people like us, which I happily do. But given we are the only people sharing information relevant to our experiences, means that our access to sexual and reproductive rights isn't even our access to sexual and reproductive rights. It's other people's access who fit a certain description, fit in certain ease of operation that we don't. I think people see that disabled queer people are often insular or unwilling to leave our communities. Of course I am. I'm the only person, I only want to be surrounded by people who actually understand me and my needs. Of course, I don't leave my community often because they're the only people who actually see me. And I'm going to tell one last story before I send off into like question time for us today. And it is about, I don't even know how to describe it. I'm just going to tell the story. My partner and I recently had an experience where we shared a bacterial infection during sex. It's normally very taboo to talk about, but I'm intentionally trying to make it not taboo. We went to the chemist, we got the treatment that we needed, and we read on the packet that it said you could have sex while undergoing treatment for this condition, as long as you put on the gel needed after that. So of course, my partner and I did what partners who want to have sex do, and we did. And then we passed the bacterial infection from one person to another because the packaging in saying that we could have sex was about a cis woman and a cis man being able to have sex with each other and not pass the condition to each other. As two trans people who have bodies that share some parts, we could pass it to each other. And I'm immunocompromised, and I got incredibly, incredibly sick from this infection. I'm still experiencing an autoimmune reaction to this infection that started about 4 months ago. This shows, I think, the impact in a very privileged way that not accurate information about sex, sexuality, reproduction, rights, and bodies as disabled queer people can have. I've had to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on medications to treat my autoimmune reaction to this infection that, had I been given accurate information, would never have happened. And I guess I just want to end this by sharing that the advocacy for sexual and reproductive health and rights needs to be led by people like me, people who also have other intersectional identities, because our needs not being met means the overall fight for sexual and reproductive health and rights isn't actually being fought for, because it's not being fought for all of us. Self-advocacy for people like us is important, but it's also exhausting, and we often don't have the capacity to do it. So allies in the room, and also those of us who are fighting the good fight but are tired, pick those allies and get them to fight for us, because sometimes our bodies and brains and existence just needs to rest, and the fight must continue. Thank you.
Thank you so incredibly much for sharing your experiences. I deeply, deeply resonate with a lot of what you said. And as someone currently sitting in hospital with a bacterial bladder infection, I feel a lot of what you've experienced. And thank you for sharing your stories and highlighting why it's so important to destigmatize these conversations and the inaccuracy of the usual suspects and the heteronormative information that you received, which in turn led to what you're experiencing, which is like wholly unacceptable. And I'm so sorry you're having to experience this on top of all the other health conditions you're going through, including endometriosis, which is very painful. I really appreciated how you were able to navigate and share your stories, because stories are so strong and so powerful, and they do have such a great ability to create change. Sharing your experience as a trans person, recognizing that our body doesn't often belong to us. It's so medicalized or unmedicalized, or people feel entitled to have an opinion about our existence, whether we even deserve to exist. And it is exhausting. And your mentioning of having to compartmentalize and turn off different parts of ourselves so that we aren't too complex or too difficult to be cared for is just really not okay. It's really not acceptable. And we are very, 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 very tired, as you've mentioned. And so many of us in the room share or have experienced in some way, shape, or form a lot of what you've been able to provide us with insights from. There's so many questions, so many things to consider, so many aspects. Even just your highlighting that, you know, if adoption was something you wanted to do, like the first thing is, oh, you know, disabled people aren't deemed appropriate enough to do that. So that's a barrier even before we can enter the door, such with so many things. And your stories are very powerful. What you've shared, what everyone has shared today has been incredibly powerful. They've been able to provide so much insight, highlighting that rest is important, is crucial. And, you know, allies, picking allies, finding allies, not wanting to leave community, because why would we? Thank you. That was very powerful. Thank you to all of our presenters today for sharing your experiences. They've all provided so many different aspects, topics, considerations, and subject matters, all relating to what we want at the end of the day, which is bodily autonomy, right to choose, right to exist, right to decide, to be treated with dignity and respect. So now we do have some time for questions. Thank you to everyone who has submitted a question so far. The questions are towards all of our presenters today. So we have a few, and I will just throw them out there. And if anyone would like to answer, please do. So the first question for today is, how does Australian policy need to change to support the sexual and reproductive rights for women and gender diverse people with disability?
Is speaking. I'm happy to jump in first, but mainly just to reiterate points that the other speakers shared around co-design and lived experience leading decisions. I think so-called Australian policy as it stands is not actually ever going to be able to affirm our rights unless people like us are the ones designing the policy, making the decisions, but then also ensuring the policy is implemented. It's all well and good to say, yes, disabled people of marginalised genders can access these things, but often that's not the reality. So making sure that we have the power and the money and the capacity to lead these spaces is the only way we will ever have them be serving us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Is. Having just that co-design and that representation is so important. Would anybody else like to add?
I think I might just add, I think we've all heard the, you know, we all often use nothing about us without us. And one of the things that I've been watching on an international level is people not saying nothing about us without us, just saying nothing without us. So we don't only want a voice in things that directly relate to us. We want to be involved in everything because everything does relate to us. So yeah, so I think that's an interesting change in some of that language, and I think it's yeah, probably relevant. I think if we're only ever, you know, invited to speak at things that are just related to disability, then we're not going to get, you know, where we need to be in the, you know, time frame that might be appropriate.
Absolutely. I think having, you know, these directed conversations are important, but like work mainstream, you know, just everything, and highlighting that it really does need to be recognised on a much larger scale, a much larger level in all areas. If anyone would like to add to that, that'd be great. Yeah,
I think it's Karin here. I think additional to being at the table, there needs to be more women and girls with disabilities coming through as policy writers coming through as representatives to the UN, coming through as leaders in the NDIS or other service spaces that people with disabilities are in all sectors, coming through in science, in medical health care, like women and girls with disabilities being these professionals. I think that's really going to be like the only way that you are going to achieve any ongoing systemic change. And these are hard ceilings to break, but I think we've just got to keep advocating for our rightful place in these environments.
Absolutely. And I guess that's what a lot of, not I guess, I absolutely know that's a lot of the work that what WIDA is trying to achieve through all of the work we're doing through the WIDA Lead project, all the various grassroots organizations across Australia, all the DPOs, you know, where like that, at the end of the day, that's what we're all working towards achieving, and we continue to try to strive and achieve and bring awareness to this, which is so crucial. And I guess on that note, which is related, the next question is where can we focus our advocacy in this space, and have we already answered that question? Would anybody like to highlight a main area of advocacy focus? Not, we do have one. Sorry.
I actually, so in my presentation, I talked about the idea of including ableism as a social determinant of health. And that was brought up by a woman I spoke to here in Queensland. And I actually think that has a lot of merit, because you can then, if it's recognised, you can hopefully begin to start stamping out some of those historically held beliefs and assumptions. And so the things that happen with is and their partner won't happen again, because you're actually starting to stamp out some of those, I guess, misconceptions, you know, incorrect information, and have that more holistic view that's inclusive of everyone.
Absolutely. Just even that, I think people like even that information wasn't even considered, and like it's because we live in such a heteronormative society. It's just like, oh well, you know, it really is. We have time for one last question. Any questions that haven't been addressed, we will follow up on. It's got a bit of a blurb and a bit of a history, so I'll read out the entire question, and anyone who wants to tackle the question, please just feel free to. So the question is, coercive healthcare, such as coerced operations, medications, hospitalizations, ABA therapy, etc., are obviously linked with sexual and reproductive violence, as they are an erosion of bodily autonomy, self-determination, and consent. Writer Anne Carson writes about the particular sensations when parts of your body are touched for the first time. I'm talking about the sensations from sex and surgery. My question is this: while it is undeniable that coercive healthcare, not explicitly about sex or reproduction, e.g. an operation on the leg rather than something involved in reproduction, is linked to sexual and reproductive violence, can it be sexual and reproductive violence on its own? And where is the boundary drawn between coercive healthcare that is not sexual and reproductive violence? Or is that coercive healthcare? Was that question, did I read, was that question perceived in the same way that I perceived it? I can put it in the chat as well. It's a bit complex. I guess if anybody wants to interpret that, I think it was coercive healthcare explicitly about sex or reproduction? Is it linked to reproductive violence, and can it be reproductive violence on its own? And where is the boundary drawn between coercive healthcare that is sexual and reproductive and is not?
I don't know whether I can answer the question, but I can certainly relate to the experience, because I on more than one occasion have felt that I've made a decision about my healthcare, but on further deeper ongoing analysis have realised, oh no, wait, there was a coercive element, because I considered other people's needs, like my support staff or whatever, and so there was a bit of a pressure to consider other people's needs and interests over my own. So I can certainly relate to how it's a fine line, isn't it, between things happening without your consent and coercion. So I can certainly relate to that experience, but I'm sorry if that hasn't answered the person's question.
That's okay. We will be able to follow up on the question in terms of
I
medical.
can see Rosemary thinking, and I'm really interested in what she's thinking about.
Unfortunately, I can't give you a direct answer, but what I can tell you is that the jurisprudence around ill treatment, the definitions within torture, because the torture provision is not just torture, it's inhuman punishment, inhuman treatment. So there's a broad range of the standard of torture, and also within health, what is coercive and forced has been discussed a lot, not just at the international level, but also within domestic regimes as well. And so it would come down to a case-by-case basis, and there are grey areas. But that, what Karin was just talking about, is a classic ableist scenario where we internalise our disability and the needs or wants of others are somehow prioritised over our own. And so for CRPD, the weight of that would bear strongly on any decision about where that sat in the hierarchy around, does it meet the torture threshold or ill treatment threshold. That coercive element, where the institutionalised nature of people, where staff or support people are prioritised over the individual, means that their impairment is what is creating the denial of that right. And so I believe it would be enough to trigger that threshold. But as I say, the law is never just a cut and dried situation, and it will be a case-by-case determination in many instances of what that threshold is. But there is a wealth of information out there and jurisprudence that has been developed by special rapporteurs, by committees, both CEDAW, the Human Rights Committee, and to a lesser extent CRPD, because it hasn't been around as long. But there is guidance there if people are interested.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, on providing that. We have many other questions that have come through. We've had lots of positive comments. The team will get back to anyone whose questions haven't been answered or addressed today. We're out of time for now, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up today. And firstly, thank everyone who has attended today's webinar. Huge thank you to all of our presenters today. Thank you for sharing your professional expertise, your personal expertise, your lived experiences, all the various intersections that make you all who you are, the personal stories, and all the various suggestions and need for change from our community, from our allies, from within ourselves, from within our community. A huge topic, and a huge thank you to everyone involved. Once again, you're more welcome to continue to submit any questions. The team will get back to you. We would also once again like to thank the Department of Social Services again for the funding of the Widow Lead project. We really value everyone's time and engagement with today's webinar. We would absolutely love to receive your feedback, and we would really appreciate it if you could participate in the survey, which has just been posted in the chat function. We'll also email you a link to this survey. If you could fill out the survey now, that'd be greatly appreciated. But if not, you will receive it in an email or within our communications associated with this webinar. In addition to that, you'll receive a link to the recording of today's webinar when it becomes available. So please feel free to share it with your family, friends, the community, any allies, any organisations, or anyone who you think would benefit from today's webinar to continue the fight that needs to be fought for all of our rights. You can follow the work of our presenters through our newsletter, as well as following them individually throughout their various platforms. A huge thank you again to Rosemary, Kelly, Karin, and Iz for today. And to close up, please do connect with Women with Disabilities Australia on all of our social media platforms. It's WWDA on all platforms. There's also a closed Facebook page called Women with Disabilities Australia, or WWDA. And for any information about anything that was shared today, please visit the WIDA website at wwda.org.au or get in touch with us via socials. Thank you all to everyone, and I hope you have a pleasant rest of your day and happy holidays, festive season, and New Year.